I'm Chris Horseman. That was what we called the attract mode from a video disc game. We produced it at Atari in the early 1980s. I'm sorry about the quality, 30 years have passed. It wasn't the greatest game, but it was a great attract mode. It also wasn't my game, but I saw it right through the development process, and my wife worked on one called Playland, which used the same sort of mechanism and didn't get released. Does anybody remember when Atari was a really big name and exciting? I think perhaps most of this audience are the age that kind of fits. Well, in those days it was a very early industry. We had a lot of enthusiasts, particularly the people that produced the games, but it's turned into a $70 billion industry that rivals the film industry. And a lot of lessons have been learned in the games industry in terms of getting people to engage. And many of those were learned at the very beginning when I was involved with it. These lessons are primarily about engagement. What I'd like to do today is show you how I and others have used some of those in creating e-learning and how similarly the design process has evolved. So first of all, a little nostalgia. In my life, I've had the privilege to work in two very interesting industries, the first being video games and the second being e-learning. And I've been fortunate enough to be responsible for some innovation in both. So the first rendered 3D games in the industry were mine. And I did some of the first multimedia learning on CD-ROM with Xebec and some of the first online learning, again, with Xebec. So blind luck got me into the games business. It certainly wasn't my art skills, because as I remember it, I drew the dart screen down there. And it's amazing to look back now and say that we thought these were the closest thing to real-life challenges. But I did end up running a games unit in the UK, and we had a number of #1 games that got me headhunted to Atari in California. So the... not you pressing the button yet? I'll get there. Okay. At the ripe age of 24, I found myself in California, earning a salary 10 times what I'd been earning in the UK, and with access to a private jet. And I was a vice president in the most exciting company in the world at the time. Today it might be Google or Facebook. After a brief spell running software development for the home computer industry, I got a remit to produce advanced games for all our platforms, including the coin-op games and the games machine at home, with no market pressure. So we could do pure R&D, and we could produce stuff that was leading edge. It included being involved to some degree in almost all of the original game development that went on at Atari. So I had a kind of unique perspective across the divisions. Come on, come on. Here we go. Yeah, not everything worked perfectly. We had a major disaster with ET. It wasn't mine. It was the games machine one that got millions of cartridges buried in the desert, which incidentally, there's an archaeological research going on at the moment. They're actually going to dig some of these things up again. I think I've still got some. But this was okay. It was actually a very, very interesting project because I got to work with Steven Spielberg for a week, and then I got about 4 weeks to actually produce the game and get it to market. So bit of excitement both ways. The success of the game was judged in very simple terms by the number of units sold, to a lesser degree the cost of the units, and operators who bought the arcade games, they measured the daily take, and this was collated by the industry magazines and published. So every month you had these charts come out. So we had a very rapid and powerful barometer for what engaged people. Part of it was sound and vision, how it appealed to your eyes and ears. We had the ability to create reasonably recognizable images, add sound effects, audio, and even in some cases video and voice. The more media we could use, and in some cases the more immersive we could make the game, we knew that it would have an impact on the sales. So increasing resolution and detail helped, voice and sophisticated sound, and anything novel. A game came out called Dragon's Lair, which was the first interactive video disc movie. It was very, very successful. And another example of this was where we just put multiple monitors on a racing game and suddenly had a big hit on our hands. So all sorts of things could increase engagement at that time. When we added new interfaces, we drew play away from other games, as people just like to try different things out. However, the biggest part of it was always the gameplay. It was how the game felt, how it was designed and how you controlled it. But the most important thing was that you felt it treated you fairly. That you could progress, and there were new and interesting things, and they were just a hair away from where you got to last time, so you just kept trying. The games industry spent a lot of money learning these lessons, and much of what they learnt we can exploit in e-learning. Okay. The process of getting money from arcade game players has a lot more in common with getting adults to learn online than might be initially obvious. Our first job was to reel the player in an arcade environment. A crucial element of the game was the attract mode. We had not only to get people interested in our game, but to compete with all the other games in the arcade. It's hard to remember how big this business was, but every shopping area in the US would have their arcade. And some of these arcades had hundreds of games, so there was enormous competition for the attention of users. When Laserdisc emerged, we could incorporate the excitement of movies, as you saw at the beginning with that attract mode from Firefox. In e-learning, it's just as important to grab a learner as a player with hooks like humor, a scenario, a challenge, as long as it's relevant. So whether you're designing or assessing e-learning, do you make sure the learner has a reason to stick with the program?
What?
Sales figures.
Can
You call
Mrs.
these
Sam?
sales figures? I would call them lack of sales figures. But why am I surprised?
You can see how you're doing as you go, and at the end, we'll calculate your score.
We do American as well as UK English programs. I just happened to capture that for the American one. So that first one was a very, very inexpensive screen. It was just a cartoon. But by getting a raised voice, somebody shouting, we can attract attention because people don't expect it. I've actually just personally discovered a new aspect of this. We sell in America using a website called Open Sesame, and there are thousands of courses on it. And our two best-selling courses on this website are Managing Conflict and Difficult Behavior and Delivering Powerful Presentations. And looking at our range, those are the two most actively titled courses that we have. So this is now causing us to look at all of our other course titles. So even the title can be a factor in engagement, getting people interested to use these. So back to games. Once the player had put in their quarter or their 10p, we had to very rapidly set objectives and give initial instructions.
Where is it?
Can you turn up a bit?
Russia. You've got to steal it.
Thanks.
Once you are airborne, you have two objectives. Avoid their tracking systems and find your refueling point.
Okay, on the learning side, this tends to translate to what the learner will be able to do as a result of the course and what they have to complete to get there. Now, players could also decide to enter our video games at different levels, and that was a way of acknowledging experience. Whoop, let's click this on the right place. Which they preferred, and so did we, as it reduced the time that a player occupied the system for their quarter or 10p. The same thing's true of learners, where we can acknowledge their learning. For example, through pre-testing and allow them to save theirs and the company's time, we also reduce boredom, so we know that that's effective. So the next step is the game starts. Or in our world, the information is delivered as immersively and interactively as possible. The subject to good gameplay or good e-learning design overall is a bit big for today, so I'll have to wait for another time. As the game went on, we used to provide hints and clues. As the player, here's a simple one that just cues players in what to do initially. So that last piece is the actual control yoke the player's using, and to take off, they need to pull back the control yoke. So in the e-learning world, it tends to be in the form of remedial feedback from formative exercises or additional information you make available where students want to drill down beyond basic course content. Next step in the game is to increase the challenge. Now, we would make things faster, we'd add complexity, we'd add little things chasing you. In e-learning, to increase the challenge, we're probably moving through the levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So we're starting to move through from simple checking understanding exercises to application and simulation. And finally, in a game, we provide feedback, which could range from you being carried on the back of a host of elves as in the original Crowther and Woods adventure, or being told by Clint Eastwood to ice up a cold one as you're coming home. So there you have the basics of our gameplay structure. What we didn't do with games, but we need to do with e-learning, is provide some route for transfer of skills. In our case, we provide interactive e-books to remind people of the learning and to provide a practical tool to help take the e-learning into the workplace. There was an exception to this where we converted a game called Battlezone to the military M60 simulator, which was it was increasing complexity, but it was used to train tank commanders in the field. With games, however, we did need to get players to come back to the game, and that's something we don't necessarily have to do with e-learning. And I don't know if you remember Space Invaders, very big hit. It wasn't just a hit because the gameplay was quite good. It was a hit because it was the first game that had a high score table you could put your own initials into. And it was particularly good because when the arcade operator switched the game off at night, all the high scores were erased. So when you started playing it the next day, it was always a fairly easy target to get your name onto the high score table. So it allowed people to challenge themselves and progress and improve. And that was a major factor in that game being a hit. So from game design to Gagne, events structure, something we use to help structure good learning. I appreciate Gagne is a little contentious for those of you who come across it. Very similar to what we do with game design up to point 3 here, where we're actually in Gagne recalling prior learning, then presenting the stimulus, the learning material, providing learning guidance as the learner works through it, eliciting performance by going up the steps of Bloom's, and providing feedback as opposed to a straight score, assessing performance, and enhancing retention and transfer. But there's a great deal of similarity between the two methodologies. So that's gameplay, but it's not just about design or content, it's also how you interact. And I found it interesting how much the interface, how much impact the interface had. I worked on some rather wacky ones. We had the Atari Mind Controller, or the Mind Link officially, which was great fun. When you first put it on, you had a paddle on the screen, and you discovered that by really concentrating, you could move the paddle from left to right. What we actually did was we took the muscle action, electricity from the muscle action in your eyebrow muscles, and we used that to move the controller. So it was really a complete gimmick, and in fact, it was never actually released. But I understand that a real Mind Controller is now on the horizon using brainwaves. We had another one which was really great fun, and I had this at home for a long time. I used to take it home for parties. It was called Feet Don't Fail Me Now, and it was a running pad we connected up, and we used to have monsters chasing you. So it was the only video game developed that you actually faced away from. But that has directly evolved into the dance mats and dance games that you see in the arcades now. So over 30 years, not much has changed. Other really great interfaces. This was the Star Wars Flight Yoke. Star Wars was a great game. It was one of the ones that I was involved in consultancy level on. And I think my wife actually worked on the controller software. And it was very, very intuitive, very personal. And all of these, the second one down was this lovely heavy trackball controller that made a game called Missile Commander hit. It wasn't an amazing game, but it was just such fun to control, and it gave you this real sense of urgency. And the final one, my wife's favourite game, was Tempest, which had a spin controller that had a lot of momentum in it. So you could spin it and change it, and you were firing down a tube at these things climbing up. And that, again, made a hit out of a game that otherwise perhaps wouldn't have been amazing. So interface is very important, as well as gameplay or e-learning design. Now, the game interface has now changed really quite a lot. So in 2013, according to Newzoo research, the game revenues will grow to about 70.4 billion this year, so massive industry. Number of people in the world playing games will surpass 1.2 million. And when you consider the proportion of the rich world, you know, that's a hell of a lot of those people who have access to this who are using games. And although the PC has the largest market share at the moment, tablet games grew this year by 35%. And it is extremely likely that tablet games will overtake all of the other games over the next couple of years. The rise is so fast. And I believe that that's because it's an interface for personal preference. There's an intimacy to mobile devices that partly because you just touch what you want, that parallels the best of the game interfaces. And I think there's that, and the fact there's an extraordinary flexibility means this preference that's coming along for mobile devices. Now, how many of you are using, for some of these, would rather use a mobile device than book or TV or PC? Are you starting to use your mobile devices for preference for these things? Yeah, quite a few. And I think it's really, I think we probably all would agree, it's only a matter of time before these devices become prevalent in e-learning, because they are an amazing convergence of all these things. Also, there's certain things they work really well for. I mean, on a building site, if you want to give every visit to the building site a bit of health and safety training, you can have a case like this, you can drop it onto a concrete floor, it won't do any damage. It's practical to take that into a building site, give 20 minutes health and safety training to somebody, give it back, it'll communicate with tin can to an LMS, you'd know all your visitors have done it, so it's opening up potentially new areas that we haven't used e-learning in before. So in summary, wouldn't it be great if your learners wanted to use e-learning as much as they like to play games? When you're looking for what to put in front of your learners, engagement, I think, should be a primary consideration. So when they're engaged, hopefully they'll spend longer, it'll be more effective, and they'll come back for more of your learning. Over 30 years, games have evolved from blobs and simple joysticks to sophisticated multi-million-dollar productions, and from an audience of enthusiasts to a market of billions. If there are lessons to be learned from the games industry, it's that engaging people in e-learning means they'll spend more time and get more out of it. And the convergence of learning onto the same devices that users choose as their primary digital home, and the open-minded approach from some employers about people using their own digital devices at work will, I hope, mean better engagement of users, and perhaps the best opportunity yet for those like all of us who are engaged in the creation and use of e-learning. So I think that's going to be a great opportunity until, of course, the mind controller eventually does come along and take over. Anyway, thank you very much for your time.